most available, but it can happen with her doctor as well. The idea is, whoever her healthcare provider is, she needs to have an opportunity to get to know them as a personal friend, a professional personal friend. In these models of care, and I've worked in this way myself for about 15 years in a private midwifery practice where midwives had an access agreement with the local hospital, and we would take women into hospital for birth and then take them home again afterwards. I understand very much the way the midwives work in these models, and having observed midwives working this way in many birth settings in Australia, New Zealand, Denmark and the UK, what I observed was not only the development of the relationship and the way they cared for women, but also every room, every birth room they ever went into in a hospital, they changed it entirely. They moved the furniture around. They took pieces of furniture out. They usually took the monitors out of the room. The neonatal resuscitation trolley they put outside the door. They put the bed way over to the side of the room, and in some cases when there were lots of family members, they took it out of the room altogether and put the mattress from the bed on the floor. They would bring in gym mats, birthing balls, bean bags, all sorts of things to make a cosy nest for the women. So for me, randomised controlled trials really are somewhat of a black box. You don't know what exact mechanism is going on inside that black box of the trial that might be an ingredient that is making a difference. So for me, it seemed to be it's both a relationship-based model of care that is going to alter various aspects of the woman's neurophysiology, but also there's something about an optimal birth environment that needs to happen. If you have both of those things happening, the woman's neurophysiology carries on in the way that it was designed to carry on in order for a baby to be born healthy, vigorous, and in the right route in order to collect all of the beautiful components of the maternal microbiome and all sorts of things that happen if the baby is born vaginally. So it's a critically important thing to do. If the baby is born in that way, not only the mother's a system called the Calm and Connect system is functioning, which is optimal neurophysiology, which lowers makes optimal oxytocin occur, lowers her blood pressure, heart rate, increases pain threshold, etc. Normal birth is more likely to happen, but if that happens, then in turn the baby's Calm and Connect system is also optimized. So this is a system nature's designed a long time ago to make sure the human species survives. So it's something we need to pay attention to. I have gone on since then to investigate even more in depth about epigenetic changes that are contingent upon the way that we are born. And as midwives and architects and interior designers, you have to get the idea that actually being born vaginally is critically important for the survival of our species. Whilst there are certainly women who could only survive and their babies could only survive if they had a caesarean section, we have now gotten to the point of epidemic proportions of caesarean sections happening. And we have to work even harder in terms of relationship-based models of care, making them more available and accessible for women, but also thinking really carefully about what do we mean by an optimal birth environment. So yeah, that's my story, where I got to. So let's begin. We all know the story of the neurohormone and neurotransmitter adrenaline. It's secreted from the adrenal glands in emergency situations in order to help the human organism pay attention and do something, change behaviour in order to survive. So, in any occasion when mammals experience the feeling of being scared, indeed, or feel cold, or feel observed, there's an amazing part of the brain that lights up when somebody behind you is looking at you, and you will notice, it might not be at a very conscious level, very much at an unconscious level, your body notices when somebody's looking at you. This is critically important for architects and interior designers and people building birth units. Women notice, or their brain at least notices, when they're being observed, and very amazing changes go on in their neurophysiology in response, because it's a primal issue. We need to know if there's a predator behind us or out of our view, direct view, that might harm us, so that we need to take action. So feeling observed is critical. You all know the responses. If you get a huge adrenaline surge, heart rate speeds up, you get prickly sensations in your skin, the little hair follicles on your arms and the back of your neck kind of move up. And again, it may not be a conscious level, but you get the feeling that something's not right. And I don't feel quite safe in this space. On the other hand, we have a beautiful neurohormone, neurotransmitter, oxytocin. Oxytocin is the key hormone of childbirth. There are many other hormones that operate during childbirth. Oxytocin is the powerhouse, or the orchestrator of the whole system. We focus on it generally because of its mechanical effects, inducing and maintaining effective uterine contractions, leading to eventually the baby being born, and then the placenta being born, and then any kind of bleeding being controlled. The neurohormone oxytocin is the key orchestrator of all of this process. But it also has amazing behavioural effects. Nathalie Angier is a medical author who wrote this amazing statement about giving birth is actually a feat of cataclysmic stress. Thank goodness it's mediated by the neurohormone oxytocin, because this is what endogenous oxytocin does. And I emphasise endogenous oxytocin because artificial oxytocin doesn't cut the mustard in terms of the complexity of what endogenous oxytocin can do. The artificial hormone oxytocin can make the uterus contract, but it can't do all these other things. And this is what it does. And this is only part of the story. It acts on every area of the brain. It's produced in local sites in the body as well. But these are the things that various pieces of research, from animal research to human research, have discovered. It enhances nutrient absorption. And that was first identified in neonatal intensive care units, where tiny premature babies, if they were nursed against their mother's chest or their father's chest, or carried around by the nurses in the NICU, they put on weight faster than the babies that were left in the intensive care cots. So it enhances nutrient absorption. Oxytocin reduces your stress levels. It's anxiolytic. It increases your pain threshold, conserves your energy and induces sleep. So you see what happens for a woman in labour when she's in well-established labour with really strong contractions happening. It's reducing her stress. It's also increasing her pain threshold, so she doesn't experience it as a kind of an overwhelming experience. It conserves her energy, so between contractions she can nod off to sleep if she's full of oxytocin, because we haven't interfered with it. Of course, it reduces her blood pressure and her heart rate. It can balance your body temperature, so interesting experiments and research around that. It enhances your social memory so that you develop an absolute attachment to that baby, because there's a process that goes on that initiates that attachment and bonding, and it has to do with your social memory. It improves her learning ability. It facilitates all sorts of affiliative behaviour, love and altruism. And we know it makes the uterus contract. So those are just some of the wonderful things that the endogenous neurohormone oxytocin can do. And you can't talk about oxytocin without mentioning work by Kirsten Uvnäs Moberg from Sweden, because she's a neuroscientist who's worked in the area of investigating the effects of the neurohormone oxytocin for decades. I first heard her talking about this probably in the 90s, when some of you weren't even born,
where she was talking about the effects of oxytocin on breastfeeding for the mother and for the baby. She's done this beautiful diagram of birth as a psychological journey facilitated by neurohormonal mechanisms, and I recommend you having a look at that paper when you get an opportunity. But she also mentions in a couple of points where the red arrows are sitting there about calm, safe environments, because she agrees it's about relationships and also about the environment that the woman is experiencing that enhances the production of oxytocin and enables all these amazing things to happen. Howsoever, here's the issue. We mammals cannot release oxytocin when our level of adrenaline is high. And this is why. As humans, we've developed an amazing brain, a neocortex and a limbic system. And in fact, Michel Odent describes our neocortex as a bit of a problem, really, in childbirth, because our brain can imagine all sorts of things. And in the middle of the brain is the limbic system, which is hardwired to translate emotions that our imaginations might have stirred up. Our dreaming body is what Bianca Lepori would refer to it as. It's able to either consciously, but mostly subconsciously or unconsciously, identify threats to feeling safe. And our brain is actually scanning, all of us, while we're sitting here at the moment, scanning second by second to check that the space that we are in is safe. And it's picking it up through our not only our kind of perception of where we are consciously, but our unconscious feelings of how we are sitting, how we are feeling, what's going on in the room, the rest of the environment, who might be coming in behind us, things like that. It translates all of these pieces of information and emotions into molecules that affect what's going on in our bodies. And as architects and interior designers and midwives, we need to understand that this is what's going on all of the time for women in labour. And because it's a potentially vulnerable time where the woman is having to focus on giving birth to a baby safely, her brain's actually quite hyper alert at the moment and scanning even more to check that she's in a safe place. Because if this place is not safe, she needs to move somewhere else. So think about it. What is her brain doing in these kinds of spaces? What have we designed? The black and white picture is of a birth unit in the 1960s. And I have to say, most of the places that I have visited around the world have not evolved very much since that design of the 1960s, which is basically a modified operating theatre. We have the bed in the middle, it's narrow, not particularly comfortable, high, narrow bed in the middle of the room with overhead operating theatre lights, with an array of instruments beginning to be decorating the room with, in case we might need them at any moment for any event that might happen. So in the 60s, that's what we began with. The one on the right is a relatively more recent picture from Denmark, where we appear to have added a little bit more technology, as happened around the world in every place I've ever visited. But there are many things happening. From the minute the woman walks into the hospital, she has to walk along corridors, generally which are, in many cases, accumulating all sorts of artefacts and objects that have to do with birth or not. They just happen to be stored in the corridors. I'm amazed at some places I've been to visit, they know we're coming to visit, and the corridors are replete with pieces of equipment and trolleys with linen and food trolleys and all sorts of paraphernalia and artefacts of the health system and birth. So what is the woman's brain perceiving in those kinds of spaces? Or these? The one on your is that your right? Can't work it out. Is a picture taken last week in one of the birth units in the city in which I live, where they've made a bit more space and managed to move the bed to one side and made sure that all the equipment is still there just in case we need it. And equipment comes with all sorts of other paraphernalia, tubing and metallic things and objects, all sorts of artefacts. What is the woman's brain perceiving when we usher her into this space? Or these. There are signs usually on the walls. Often they are APGAR scoring charts, or they are, some of them have quite alarming things written on them. If you go around to any maternity unit, you start reading the signage that is produced all over the place. It can be quite frightening if you're sitting there for hours, you've got nothing much else to do, and you start reading what it is. Why would you have plastic aprons hanging behind the door? The mother might be thinking, is that they don't get splashed with blood or something? What's going on? What are the messages? Okay. One of the things that those rooms are designed for is to be able to look at the mother, to observe her, to surveil her. That's what the staff are required to do, and that is the message that she gets when you usher her into that kind of a space. And I've said to you already, the limbic system is hardwired to translate those emotions to keep us safe, and surveillance is one of the main things that will activate the amygdala in the centre of the limbic system. And the amygdala is going to stimulate the adrenaline release. This theory I developed during my PhD, again in the years before most of you were born, but we called it the fear cascade theory, trying to understand why, once labour begins, the two main reasons for all intervention in childbirth are these things at the bottom of the row: uterine inertia and fetal distress. And there are various pieces of research which can show you these are the effects of adrenaline on oxytocin. Adrenaline disrupts the nice rhythmical rhythm of oxytocin production during labour and can either make it less rhythmical, so the woman experiences what we end up calling incoordinate uterine action, because she gets big contractions and small contractions and it doesn't actually become effective and go anywhere, or it gets to the point where it looks like labour has slowed down to the point where it stops. We call that uterine inertia, and we, in our hospital system, then want to speed that up, and so we will put in artificial oxytocin to make the contractions continue. On the other half of the equation, adrenaline, the action of adrenaline is to mobilise the body, ready to run away or get ready to fight, or to become so still that you become unnoticeable. And it does this by diverting blood from what's considered to be non-essential functions in a frightening situation. So it moves blood away, indeed, from the abdomen to put it into our legs and arms ready to run or fight. And so it constricts the blood vessels going into the uterus. It disrupts uterine blood flow and thereby disrupts placental perfusion. Now, most babies are pretty robust and can handle this to a certain extent. Some babies are not so robust, or if it goes on for a long time, you disrupt fetal oxygenation, and the result is fetal distress. If we end up with fetal distress that we can't fix by rehydrating the mother or helping her to feel more calm and comfortable, we end up with a caesarean section. So this is potentially the consequence of not having a relationship-based model of care and an optimal birth environment. What we developed was called, or recently developed, is an emotional design brief, a term coined by the head of infrastructure and planning from our local health district. I was interested in designing birth units, so when I moved back to this district, I took to him a wad of papers about this is what you need to consider if you're doing birth unit design. If you're going to do one, new one, can you let me know, because I'm happy to come and help. He took them away and I've never seen them since. But I know he's been talking to other people in the health system, because one day he rang me up and said, do you know what? We've just got a contract from the government for $700 million to build an entire new hospital. And all of these ideas that you've written about in here about women and birth units, wouldn't that work for everybody coming into a hospital? So could you come and help us, please, to understand more about what we might need to include in our hospital design? And so he was the person who coined the term an emotional design brief. He's an architect and also interested in research. Ramsey Awad is his name. It was initially, I explored this with another group of colleagues in developing something we called the BUD set, the Birth Unit Design Spatial Evaluation Tool, which has now been tested, validated in various settings and with various populations. It's been translated into about 10 different languages, because people are clearly using this in different parts of the world. And what you can do is has a set of criteria that need to be met for an optimal design. But you can take it around and look at what's listed there to see how is this functioning in my unit, so that you might be able to identify areas that need improvement. But that work began about 15 years ago. We also started doing work with developing a hypothetical model of what it is that women might need for the relationship between birth unit design and safe, satisfying birth. And we used some work of Bianca Lepori, who I'd worked with many years before in New Zealand, where she came and helped us design to a birth centre. But what Bianca had written about was that studies of women who had given birth at home, and she worked with Sheila Kitzinger, another guru of childbirth, and went with her to many home births as an architect to see just what it is that women did at home. And she observed that women seldom give birth in the bedroom if they're at home, but more often in their sitting room, where they select an empty and protected area, usually behind furniture, never exposing themselves at the centre of the scene, which is what we require them to do by the way we've designed current birth rooms. So the birth room built to house women in hospitals is clearly a bedroom, not the cosy private nest that women create at home, but a stage on which the woman becomes a spectacle under constant surveillance and control. And remember, whilst we focus on what do women need in these spaces, they are also the workplaces of a large population of workers. And we need to create an environment for them to be able to experience a safe, comfortable workplace. So there are other researchers in the midwifery world who have explored this idea that birthplace is the midwife's workplace, and how does the place of birth impact on midwife? And we see that there are artefacts, behavioural norms, values and assumptions that go on in these spaces, and the artefacts include the symbols and objects within that birth space that express very strong cultural messages and give you expectations about a particular kind of birth that can go on in this space. Generally, the expectation is if the bed's centre stage, that's where it's going to happen, unless you do something about it. The paraphernalia that's hanging around, we're likely to use that if it's there. Athena Hammond is a wonderful PhD student who's looked at the various hardware and software implications of hospital birth unit design from a midwife perspective, and she found that midwives that she interviewed were strongly affected by the design of the birth room. They were trying to find space amongst the congestion and clutter you've seen in some of those rooms I just showed you. Trying to work underwater is an issue these days because many women want to spend time submerged either in a bath or in the shower, and I've had women in the shower for 4 or 5 hours of their labour not wanting to get out. It becomes a problem in a country that's a bit short on water where I live. But trying to create some kind of ambience in a very clinical space and being able to be equipped for flexible practice was some of the things that they thought were problematic. So the room layout, the design of equipment and fixtures all impact on midwives and their practice in both birth centre and labour ward settings, although it's relatively easier in a birth centre. So We need different design to enable more effective midwifery practice. Kathleen Fay is a wonderful midwife that I worked with many years ago who coined the term coined the idea of something about building sanctuaries or surveillance rooms, and those are the two extremes of what we have available. I'm very much focused on hospital rooms because in Australia and in many other countries, or many high-income countries, about 90% of women are going to give birth in hospital rooms. It's relatively easier if you get the funding and the support to build a beautiful birth centre, which can become sanctuary, as this English birth centre shows you in their birth centre rooms. But it's more challenging and more difficult to change that configuration in a hospital system. So, the idea of sanctuary versus surveillance room. So I've already kind of pointed out why surveillance in labour is a problem. I worked with a wonderful woman called Marie Stenglin, who's a social semiotician who reads, her work is about reading spaces. What is the space telling you? What are the power relationships in this space because of what are the artefacts and the way that it's constructed? And we wrote this paper which was talking about designing out the fear cascade to increase the likelihood of normal birth by considering this idea of surveillance versus sanctuary. So, spaces that are characterised by high levels of surveillance of the birthing woman may reassure care providers, but from the woman's perspective, surveillance may actually undermine her ability to labour effectively and give birth unaided. Surveillance increases the woman's perceived stress and sets in motion a cascade of neurohormonal events that we've talked about. Marie has written a lot about this concept of binding, which I find a particularly interesting concept, and I'm sure architects and interior designers know it they're much more familiar with it than me. But it's about the way a space closes in on or opens up around a user. For instance, if you build a cathedral, you want it to open up because you want the people coming to the cathedral to experience the awe, the power of some other being outside of yourself so that you can sit quietly in a contemplative space. But that's not quite what we want for childbirth. Binding makes us feel either secure if there's optimal level of binding, or it makes us feel insecure if we are too bound or the space is too open. This birth room in a newly renovated building was considered to be the bee's knees of its day. Lots of space to move around in, wonderful views from these enormous windows of the ocean outside, lots of room for the equipment to kind of be spread about. Women using this space wanted the blinds shut. As soon as they walked in the room, they felt exposed. They were up on the 3rd floor, but they still felt that anybody could look in on me. And most of the time, during some part of labour, women will take off their clothes. So they don't want to have a space as unbound as this, where they felt that their privacy was not going to be able to be protected. And I've been in many birth units where the blinds in the birth rooms are kept shut all the time. Women don't want to be exposed. And it may be the reason why women have gravitated in our settings, at least, and in many others, to want to spend time during labour in a bath, a tub, a pool of some description with high sides around them, because these are in fact bound spaces. And we've interviewed many women about, why did you spend 6 hours in the pool or the bath during your labour? Did it relieve your pain? Generally it does not. It does not relieve the pain, although that's not what we tell the hospital bean counters. They need it for pain relief. Why they stayed there is because it was a barrier separating her from everybody else in the room, where she felt that she was protected because other people are not going to take their clothes off and jump in the pool with me. Some people wear swimmers if they're the supporters and will get in the pool with the woman if she wants them to hold her up at some stage. But they see it as a safe haven where they are isolated and insulated from anybody being able to touch them or get at them. So this kind of an embedded enclosure has become quite important, to the point where now we require every hospital, new build or renovation, to build high-sided baths in the rooms for women to be able to spend time in during labour. And that's where they spend a lot of time, if they're given the freedom to, in a pool of some description. So there's an idea about sanctum comes from an optimally bound space. A too-bound space is problematic, and if we strap monitors around women, they feel very bound, they can't move, they're restricted. Although now we have people working out how to put on Bluetoothed monitors and things so that you can wander around, which is an advantage if you need them. But there needs to be a concept of what's an optimally bound space for the women using this particular environment. So here's the concept of the emotional design brief. We did it in 2020 by undertaking what we called an emotional design study, or a facility design study, for this new $800 million health and innovation precinct, it's called. And Ramsay asked for an emotional design brief to be prepared for the whole project. He asked me. I said, I'm not an architect, I wouldn't have an idea what's a brief anyway. He said, just give it a go. So what we did was we interviewed 75 users of the hospital, patients and their care providers, nurses, midwives, doctors, cleaners, clerical staff, porters, every array of staff possible, and a huge variety of patients, from people undergoing surgery or mental health issues or drug and alcohol, children and their families, all sorts of people. Around 25% of our participants identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, so we had an interesting diversity of opinions. And a mountain of qualitative data to wander through, and I'm a number cruncher, remember, so it's like, holy dooly. So I had a colleague help me who knows more about this than me. And so we did an analysis of the data, and we came up with these 4 key principles for the emotional design brief. People want access to nature when they're in a hospital bed. They want to be able to experience, see views of nature. They wanted to be able to walk into a garden outside in the fresh air. They wanted art, particularly Indigenous art. Even the non-Indigenous people saw the beauty in our culture of Indigenous artworks and what they were expressing. And so it became translated into, for this design brief for this hospital, that every patient room had to have a view of the outside world, and that every floor on the hospital has a huge courtyard garden. And the people we interviewed said, and we want to be able to, if we're in a bed and not able to get out of bed, we want to be able to wheel the bed out into the garden, and we want to be able to plug the ventilator into an electricity supply out in the garden. That is what they are building in this new hospital. Every floor has a garden where patients who can either walk out there and sit there with their families, or a bed can be wheeled out if somebody's able to go outside with their family, even if they're ventilated, so that we can plug them into the systems outside in the gardens. Interestingly, the only place that is not going to have a garden is the birth rooms. So there you go. They also wanted integrity and privacy, because in that current hospital... I forgot to tell you, the key issue that we said to the people when we interviewed them were only 2 questions. The first one was, tell us about your experience of coming into this hospital room, and how do you feel in this space? What makes you feel like that? are amazingly articulate. And then we said, okay, great, we've got all that down now. Imagine a new space being built. You can have anything you want. How would you like to feel in the space, and what do you think would make you feel like that? Incredibly articulate people from all of this diverse range of informants told us what they wanted. So, access to nature, and this came from the staff as well as from all of the other participants. So we didn't analyse them separately. They all said the same things. Integrity and privacy was critical. Trying to keep conversations private and confidential, because you don't have any privacy in a hospital where your beds are separated by curtains. And there were people were having intense conversations, medical staff and patients and family, in corridors in order to not disturb everybody else in the ward that they were in. So they talked in great detail about having breakout spaces where we can make a cup of tea for our family or sit down and have a meal together in the ward area if we can't go down to the hospital cafeteria, etc. They wanted individual control of their personal space, to be able to do the lighting themselves, to think carefully about noise intrusion. They wanted access to spaces. Wayfinding is always a problem in hospital design, I understand, and yeah, it was a big problem. People get lost constantly in big hospitals. But the top one on the right about being safe and secure, and they identified clearly a description of emotional safety, spiritual safety, cultural safety, and physical safety, because particularly many of the staff, but also patients, identified a neighbouring patient who was mentally unwell for various reasons, some drug-induced, some not, where physical safety was a big problem for staff and emergency departments in particular. So there was a raft of stuff. It's about a 200-page document, and I've never been able to reduce it into a nice simple paper because it is so complex. However, Ramsay required that the builders of this new hospital read the emotional design brief alongside the functional design brief for the hospital and demonstrate how it was interpreted. They have built mock-up rooms for every one of the spaces, and I've been in them. They are amazing. The hospital will be finished next year, so we've been enduring the building for a long time. Then, finally, he said, oh, okay, I've got another project for you now, Maralyn. Can you go and design a maternity hospital for me? Okay, off we went. To repeat the process. Singleton Hospital is a small township outside of the main city of Newcastle, in which I live. And this birth unit that the community designed was opened in February 2022, so we're about ready for a post-occupancy evaluation if anybody's wanting a bit of work to do. We repeated the same process. We interviewed users of the space, women and their families, and all of the hospital staff who would use the maternity unit. We ended up with 13 hours of interview data that we analysed. And these are the kinds of things, and you can see that's the unit as it did exist. How do you feel in the current space? And women and their partners and the staff said things like, well, it's the resuscitator, the first thing you see. You see everything, all of that clinical stuff. It's very clinical. It's bright lights. It highlights everything in the room, like the resuscitator and the oxygen, like it just shows you. And she's kind of sucked in her breath and looked really anxious. And you can see she didn't have to say anything. All the other women in the group started nodding their heads, saying, oh, yeah, it's really scary. One woman actually articulated as, it's a bit overwhelming because you've got all of that equipment there and you just go, no, I know what it's for, but my partner doesn't know what it's for. So it was really confronting for him to see all of that. And he said things like, is all that stuff that goes on in birth and all of that? So it's just a bit much having all that on display, I guess. And that was echoed by many of the people. So then we said, how would you like to feel in the space and what would help you feel like that? They all said, I just need space to be free and to move. Multiple spaces that you could use, not just here's the bed. You could navigate, you could look around and go, I'm trying this and this and this, and maybe the bath or the shower. Just openness. And the staff said things like, we want women to be able to get out of the bed, walk, pace, go have a coffee, like a more homely environment. They need to get out of bed. They emphasise things like smells. If somebody in the birthing team went outside to have a cigarette and they came back in the room, they said the whole room smells of cigarette smoke for the rest of the woman's labour. Women's senses are heightened, so her olfactory sense is really on overdrive, checking out what's going on in the environment. Not only her vision, but her hearing, her sense of touch. You have to be careful how you touch a woman in labour, always. But it's what she touches as well and what it feels like to her. So it's not just vision, it's hearing, it's smelling. It's tasting. You can taste chemicals in the air, and the women comment on them. So we analysed it using the bud set, which has these 4 domains in it: the fear cascade, aesthetics, facility and support. Women talked about, we want to feel safe and secure, we want privacy. So what we want you to build is what we termed a sanctum versus a surveillance space, and I wanted it to be optimally bound, not unbound. And they were very clear about what would make them feel safe and secure. In terms of aesthetics, they also talked about, we want access to nature, we want fresh air, we don't want air conditioning, we actually just want fresh air. We want to be able to open the windows so that we can get in some breezes from outside or let out the smells that are going on outside. We wanted physical supports like the birthing bath. Wayfinding was again another problem, and we want space for our supporters to be accommodated. Okay, and this is what it looks like. It's a locally interpreted idea from the local community who wanted local images, so they went out and took photographs of their local scenery to be put in the space. So there's a breakout room there where the family can come and make a cup of tea or a meal if they needed to, and the women can come out too. They made sure there was no clutter in the hallways, that the wayfinding was clear. And those are all the images in these are from local scenes that the local people wanted. This is the birth room. There's a couch there for a family member to lay down on if they want to. And they also said, we're quite happy if the midwife lays down there too, if we're busy in the bath or the shower or whatever. If she or he needs to be in here, they can relax as well. They don't have to be up wandering around. The resus machine is stored in that cupboard there, where it can be plugged into the gas and the power outlet, so it's easily accessible and ready to use. Those windows can be completely opened because the mesh screens, the beautifully decorative mesh screens outside, are not removable, so nobody can fall out or anybody can get in any way. So those windows can be opened so she can have fresh air and doesn't have to rely on air conditioning. Because this hospital is remote from the major unit, there's a camera in the top of the ceiling of the birth room, which the women actually talked about as being quite reassuring, where you can access the experts in the city hospital should you need their advice for any event. So we now have in Australia health facility guidelines, and the maternity unit guideline has all the usual suspects of the functional design brief, the schematic and the interior design brief, etc. But we now in our area require the architects use the emotional design brief alongside the functional design brief and reflect on it at every stage of the design process and demonstrate how they are using their interpretation of the emotional design brief in what actually happens. So my last slide, just that the melding of neuroscience and architecture has revealed that our experience of space is shaped through our senses, turned into molecules of emotion. And if we are to build for the future, we need to consider how our brains will read the safety of the spaces. And the emotional design brief, I think, adds a further dimension to design thinking to make visible the emotional responses of individuals to current spaces, as well as the emotional responses to imagined new spaces. And I would hope that architects and interior designers all do an emotional design brief with your communities, the whole community, not only the women and families who are going to use it, but also the staff who are using those spaces, in order to ultimately design out fear in childbirth so we can have more straightforward normal birth. Thank you.